5, 4, 3.
Hello and welcome to yet another lecture on the Nicomachean Ethics. I'm Dr. Feist, coming to you from St. Paul University, Faculty of Philosophy. And where are we? We are in the Nicomachean Ethics, Book 6, Chapter 8. And here Aristotle is picking up on what he was talking about in the last chapter. It's all about Phronesis, trying to distinguish it from things like Sophia and Techne and all that, to get a better idea as to what eudaimonia is going to be all about, namely the notion of the broad notion of happiness. Well, you got to have some kind of skills, and Aristotle had talked about those in terms of virtues. Again, way back he talked about character virtues, but the character virtues were, shall we say, a little bit empty, because although we talked about them being a mean with respect to us and avoiding extremes, the mean's not mathematical, so there's a rational element to it in the sense that it's not rational in a mathematical way, but it's rational in this kind of practical, deliberative way. So Aristotle is often running, trying to figure out what this deliberative aspect of life is, this right reason when it comes to ethics. And that leads him ultimately into the notion of intellectual virtues, and lo and behold, we get into the notion of phronesis. So phronesis is, so far, a big thing in the virtues, and it's going to be like the capstone of the character virtues. But we've had another virtue emerge, and that is Sophia. So we've got some tension going on here. In any case, back to Aristotle. He's now talking about phronesis in relation to politics. And he says they're basically the same in a way. There's kind of the same disposition, but they're not identical. So don't equate the two. And in this chapter, he sketches, and I say sketches in the sense of just kind of lays things out briefly in what some philosophers later would call an architectonic, which is just a fancy word about talking about levels and hierarchies and a conceptual map of concepts, if you will. Now, Aristotle talks about that there are many sides to. So, in other words, phronesis you might think of it as kind of like a genus with various species of phronesis. And the species deal with certain aspects of human life. Remember, phronesis is always dealing with variable truths, and those are variable because we are involved. Humans introduce the large-scale variation into the universe. And remember, Aristotle's version of the universe is a very sort of tightly clad, organized structure. And the investigation of the universe, apart from us, is largely the issue of, or the type of state of the soul that grasps truth that he had called Sophia. Now, back to phronesis. Phronesis has these many sides, and you can think of them, again, like this is a genus, and these are species. So you could have basic phronesis, home phronesis, legislative, political phronesis. So the basic one really is what Aristotle talks the most about, and that's going to be with dealing with our individual lives. When you're thinking about phronesis and how do I build a good life? So ultimately it's going to be, of course, connected to eudaimonia. So but Aristotle makes a number of remarks. And again, he was always talking about how the individuals fit into larger schemes. So the first larger scheme that you fit into, says Aristotle, is the notion of a family. And of course, Aristotle had a very conservative notion of what a family was, etc., household. And we'll see about how he thinks how a household should be run. That'll come up later in the series of lectures on the politics. But just so we understand Aristotle, he's got a very straightforward view that the individual lives in the context of larger structures, and the next structure up is the home, or if you like, the household. And that's going to be where you make decisions in terms of your individuality based on this. But of course, households are not the largest structure or community that you live in. we go up to larger ones, and these ones would be more now in the domain of the political, where you're talking of the domain, the domain now for these would be that, the community of the city. And for Aristotle, as we'll see, he has a fairly small notion of what a real community is. So ideas of large nations or better yet, large states, large countries that we have today of millions and millions of people, he would regard that as probably a mistake to try and have political structures that large, because the rulers of those political structures can't possibly really govern the whole thing. It's just too big. Anyways, we'll look at that a little bit later when we dive more deeply into the text called Politics. But the different species of Phronesis here in the city, he divides into legislative and political. And this is really the very large scale. This is the largest of the large scale, dealing with maybe constitutional or large kinds of issues. Again, we'll dive into this a little bit more later. And this would be more like immediate or low-level things like policy. So you're actually much more on the ground and much more connected to what the citizens' lives are really like. And as I said, we'll dig more into that later on. So we have this notion of Phronesis in this political sense. It's deliberative, we've seen, with policy, and Aristotle says that the people that are living on this level and working on this level, the Phronesis here is a lot like a craft. So in some ways it's like techne, and Aristotle compares sort of political people at this level to a kind of craft. And no doubt he's basing that on his experience of politicians that he would have met and known. And Aristotle does not have this disdain for all politicians, some of them, of course, but not all. But nonetheless, he thinks it's a master science, and the whole thing of having Phronesis on this large scale is incredibly important. And again, the whole notion of educating an individual is to make them into a kind of citizen that could participate properly in politics. So Aristotle also notes that Phronesis, because it concerns practical matters, right? On all its levels, it does have a practical connection, because again, even at the large scales of the city, we still are talking about what people do, how they live, and the truths that are associated with what they do, even on large scales, the objects and the things we bring forth on the large scale, political structures, armies, etc., etc. All those things too are the introduction of the variable into the universe, so the truths about them will still fall under Phronesis and not under something like Sophia, which only deals with world truths that are independent and eternal. So because it deals with these particulars, Aristotle always stresses that it's not going to be something, Phronesis that is not going to be something that you can do or have unless you have experience. You need that, because there's so much of the particular in Phronesis. Again, we've seen him stress this, and he stresses this point about the link between experience, just having experiences in your life that you build upon, that you see, that you recognize. And this is why you're going to have to be someone who, in order to exhibit Phronesis on a sophisticated scale, you're going to have to be someone that's lived for a while. And you have to only these through experience. And he thinks that this is supported by the fact that if you look just in everyday society and in cultures, he certainly would have made the cultures around the world type argument, but he certainly would have said something like this: why is it that you can have children that, children, like very young children, that can be extremely good at certain things? You could have a youngster that's very good at logic, right? Extremely good, is able to really do all kinds of demonstrations, maybe is quite even perceptive in a certain way about truths about the world, right? Because those truths are fixed and stable. You may not need a lot of experience in order to grasp those independent, stable truths about the world. They're independent from us. It's more like a seeing. or the seeing that's involved in Sophia, and in that sense, is very much like the ordinary notion of seeing. But the seeing, or the ability to grasp and the ability to think through in Phronesis is different than that, because it is so closely related, and well, it's all bound up with the things that we do and the variability that we insert into the world. So getting a handle on that requires a lot more experience. So Aristotle says that this distinction between kind of the seeing that's involved in a Sophia and the seeing that's involved in a Phronesis is going to be reflected by the fact that we have children who can be at a young age very good at technical things like playing chess or doing complex things in astronomy. We've all seen the child prodigy that at a very young age is very good at math. Aristotle says, yeah, that's not terribly surprising. It more or less is supportive of the view that we don't want a child being a legislator or being a politician. So yes, you might even be the parent of some wickedly smart kid who at 7 years old is a chess grandmaster. But you wouldn't say, oh, well, because you're a chess grandmaster at 7, I think you'll run the household now. And as a matter of fact, as Aristotle said, even children that could be a grand chess master at 7, they still don't even know how to regulate their own lives. They're just really good at an intense but narrow kind of skill. And that could be in things like understanding mathematics and chess and all that. But you're not going to have this unless you have a fair amount of experience. So again, this is Aristotle trying to pull the notion of phronesis apart and get us to think about it independently of the other modes of grasping truth. But they're still all about grasping truth. So truth and the notion of deliberation on variability, that's extremely important to phronesis. Now, I'm just going to make a quick comment about the end of the chapter. Aristotle picks up on this notion of how phronesis is related so much to experience, and he relates it even to perception. And his remarks are they're kind of puzzling. As I've tried to point out, there's lots of puzzling remarks in the Nicomachean Ethics. It's not always the case that everything Aristotle says fits with everything else, so it's not always coherent, doesn't always fit, and sometimes it seems to be kind of inconsistent, that not only does it not fit, some of the things actually seem to oppose each other. Like in a previous video, the remarks on rationality don't actually seem to contradict what he said earlier on about animals and humans. In this last bit here, Aristotle has made some puzzling comments regarding phronesis and perception. I'm not going to go into the details of it, but they're hard to read. It's hard to figure out what he's talking about. Could be a corruption in the text, hard to say. Or it just could be it's just a really difficult and perceptive view of things, and it's hard for us to sort of figure out what he was about. In any case, this has a historical split. So there have been, because these texts of Aristotle are so old, there's been centuries of debate about them. And this chapter's end about phronesis has engendered a historical split in the Middle Ages, namely between two great thinkers of the time, St. Thomas Aquinas and St. Albertus Magnus, or Albert the Great. That's what that means. So not only is he a saint, he's also Albert the Great. And in this sense, and Albertus Magnus was the teacher of Thomas Aquinas. And so there's a lot of debates as to what some of the fundamental aspects of Aristotle's commentary, like the particular comments that he makes, it's not always clear what he means, and there's a lot of debate about it. And what we're going to see later on is that it's not just about these particular little side comments. There's a debate coming about in the later books, but it's implicit in the earlier ones, about this notion of how is eudaimonia necessarily related, or is it related more to phronesis or Sophia? So what is the highest point of knowledge? Well, we've seen Aristotle sort of lean towards phronesis in a lot of ways, but yet in a previous video I pointed out how he said that's kind of absurd to think it's phronesis because humans aren't the best. So are humans supposed to be in their, for eudaimonia, are we supposed to be really, really intrinsically human and be, sort of centered on our humanity and that's the way to true happiness? Or is it where we're trying to emulate something higher like a god and go purely rational? So what's going to emerge is the tension between the truly happy life as one of activity and sort of the phronesis and practical stuff, or the truly happy life being more like one of Sophia. So what's it going to be for eudaimonia? Is it going to be ultimately leaning towards Sophia or Phronesis? We'll dig into that in a lot more detail later on. See you next video.